Does Michigan football have a case to be the number one team in the country ahead of the 2023 season? Now, they bring back a lot from last year's team, most of the major contributors from last year's team. A lot of teams do as well. I mean, Ohio State does, Georgia does, although there's turnover every year with schools like that because you just keep recruiting NFL caliber guys. And Michigan's kind of been at that point too. 9 guys drafted in this past year's draft class. We assume, I mean, there's a scenario in play where if things break a certain way for Michigan, they could come close to doubling that total in next year's draft, which would be crazy. But Clayton, while I search for who to give credit for this question, your thoughts on potentially Michigan football being number one ahead of the 2023 season?
Yeah, I do have the question here. It's from Jim Rome Stinks, and he's wondering why there's hesitancy to rank Michigan number one in the preseason polls. And I think it's probably because Georgia is coming off of 2 straight national championships. And as Kirby Smart would say, no one believed in them last year, which is just insane. But, any way to find motivation for your team, and it worked. And they were able to replicate what they did 2 seasons ago. It wasn't maybe as dominant at times. There were a couple halves, a couple games that were maybe a little bit closer than people thought. The Ohio State game could have gone a different way at the end, if Noah Ruggles doesn't miss a kick. But all in all, I think it's pretty fair to project Georgia as the number one team. They're looking to be the first three-peat national champion since Minnesota in the 1930s. And I think they deserve to be there. But the one thing is about Michigan, and Bruce Feldman said this recently, and I wrote about it a few weeks ago, but Michigan has the least amount of question marks among any of those teams right at the top. If you look at the AP poll from last year, the final one that came out after the college football playoff, after all the bowl games, Michigan was the only team in the top 7 with a returning starting quarterback. Michigan brings back Blake Corum, who could have won the Heisman Trophy if he stays healthy at the end of last season, still finished 7th in the voting. All sorts of production on offense, all sorts of production on defense. By the way, they add 7 or 8 now transfers that, many of which could impact this fall. So I feel really good about where Michigan stands. Preseason number one, couple things. I don't think it matters a ton, although it would be kind of nice. But you can keep that chip on your shoulder if you're Michigan. It worked a couple years ago when they, FPI gave them a 2% chance to win the Big Ten. They go and do that. Last season, they weren't the Big Ten favorite despite coming off a Big Ten championship. Ohio State, I think, was a unanimous favorite according to the Cleveland.com poll, which I have the numbers somewhere on this. It has pretty much been wrong, 60, 70% of the time, which is crazy because Ohio State wins it. It feels like almost every other year. So does it matter? No, we've seen Michigan do it without getting that type of recognition. I think LSU is going to be really good. I think Alabama is going to be really good. So there are teams in the mix, and probably defer to the teams with that type of talent that Georgia just keeps bringing in. And even though they lost a lot from 2 years ago, they reloaded last year. You probably expect that they're going to do the same this season. But that's not to say Michigan doesn't have a great team coming back.
Yeah, for me, preseason number one, I don't want to say it's when you put that label on a team, you're calling your shot saying, this is the team that we think will be the last team standing on the last Monday night of the season. And I still think I don't want to say it's lofty for Michigan, but if you're asking me if it's Michigan or Georgia or Ohio State or Alabama or whoever it is, I'm probably going with like a Georgia just because that's the easiest to project right now, given the recent history. Now, you're going to have some time to figure, it's a marathon, not a race. I think that's something that we've learned over the last 2 years is that, they have expounded so much energy in just getting to the college football playoff that I don't want to say they ran out of steam, but I just think they got there and weren't as good or didn't play as well. Certainly in the TCU game, winnable game that they should have had. But preseason number one, I mean, whatever. You want to be the end of season number one. So if it's 4, if it's 5, if it's 6, 7, 8, it really doesn't matter. And I think there'll be a lot of reasons that people will kind of dog Michigan throughout the season. They'll say it's because of the non-conference schedule, though. Go look at Georgia's non-conference schedule. It's every bit as light as Michigan's is, although they have they have a 4th non-conference game. I forget. I assume there's a Power 5 in there somewhere, but
Yeah.
these SEC schools are going to play an FCS game in November sometime. So, and that's a time where, Michigan, it's going to be another year where you get to November and you have to go play a game at Penn State. You have to play Ohio State at home. So it's one of those things where if you want to put stock into it, fine. But also, I don't know, I don't know that if I'm a Michigan fan, I don't know I want that label on my team, because I think this program has operated at its best over the last 2 years when they've had that chip on their shoulders. So to me, the hesitancy has a lot to do with, I think, regionally. I think the media coverage kind of tends to favor those teams in the South, and probably rightfully so in a lot of ways. But also, this is a Michigan team that hasn't won a bowl game in the last 6 or 7 tries, and has kind of struggled in the postseason. So when you're sitting there talking about calling your shot, number 1 team in the country, you're saying this is my team that's going to win a national title. Even with everything that Michigan has coming back, I still think there might be other teams that might just have a little bit higher of a ceiling, just given the fact, the recruiting rankings and things like that. So I can safely sit here and say that I think Michigan football is one of the best 2, 3, or 4 teams in the country. But number 1, I think that's going to come down to where you lie regionally and just what you value when you call your shot this time of year.
Yeah, and a couple things. One, the fact that this is a discussion is a really good thing for Michigan. The fact that there are Michigan fans out there that believe they should be the preseason number 1 team means that they have a really good team. And another thing is, a lot of these national people that come out with these type of things, or that vote in the AP and kind of set these narratives, they really like recruiting rankings. They really like the talent, blue chip ratio on the roster, things like that. And it's also a lot of, kind of pumping their own sites as well. We're owned by a recruiting site, On3, but it's kind of this self-feeding thing. It's the same thing with draft grades right after the draft. It's like you could give a draft pick an F because you had him number whatever on your big board. Well, it's all just going back to how you evaluated it. So it's kind of a meaningless exercise a little bit, but it gets you excited, thinking about the possibilities for this season if you're any of those fans, or, a fan of any of those teams at the top.
Of course, our guy Shane Johnson with a $5 super chat hopped in before the show started and said, Georgia should and will be number 1, back-to-back, and rumblings that they had a strong spring, but there's no way Michigan should be less than 2. And CB, you forgot to wish, is it George A, a happy B-Day. CB, of course, not with us tonight, but Shane, we appreciate you, and I would agree with all that. I mean, Georgia, it's kind of crazy to think with how dominant, USC was in the mid-2000s, and that Alabama has been for 20 years, that there hasn't been a team that's won 3 straight national titles. Even Clemson, that run they had for a few years. So it's tough to do. I mean, if you're a betting person and you're sitting here going, oh, is it Georgia or the field? I guess maybe you take the field, but again, Georgia is just, I know you got a taste of it in the Orange Bowl a couple of years ago, and we saw it last year once they got to the national title game. Like, Georgia is just, they're on a different level than everyone else right now. So they've kind of supplanted Alabama.
But then again, though, they're a missed kick away from not being in the national championship game. So it's, I'm not going to say I would take the field for sure, but I'm not going to say that, Georgia's not going to win it all. But I think it's kind of there for the taking too. There are plenty of teams that should be in that conversation. I think you look at the Big Ten in terms of a top 2, it's as strong as it could be again. To getting 2 teams in the playoff last year, having that opportunity to do the same this year, or have just 2 of the top contenders in the national picture all season long. I think Michigan and Ohio State. So I would take the field, and it'll be kind of interesting.